or if you have been with us before, the website that you see, go.illinois.edu/NADP training, you can see all of the webinars up to this juncture, including today's. So those that couldn't make it today, I noticed I got a few emails that said, can't make it, can we watch it later? Of course you can. So remember that for future reference, that in case you missed previous webinars, that you can always catch them at a later date. Today's title, Field Form and Data Processing. Let's go immediately to what we want to cover today. This is kind of something that we, during sample processing, talked about, but in being in the data part of the network, seeing a lot of mistakes being made in that kind of situation. So I thought it'd be best if we maybe went through each section of the field form. We've kind of done things a little bit different in our data processing. For every operator, when you send in a field form, you will receive a response back called a sample receipt report form, along with an email that says, "Dear so-and-so," listed below is, and we'll cover that here as we progress. But we're trying to, as we get implemented into the electronic gauge and to moving on to new collectors and stuff like that, be a lot more data efficient. And there are a number of areas on this field form that site operators are overlooking. So I thought this would be a good time to maybe cover some of those. So during this, if there's any questions, this is a real impromptu type of webinar. So that if any point you have any questions, my moderator and producer of this webinar, Brian Kirshner, will stop. We'll answer your question. I'll repeat your question, and then we'll answer it to the best of my ability. If I've not answered it, then we can try to get you the answers that you need. Go to the main page, and we're looking at a blank field form. Make yourself very aware right in the center where it says Field Observer Report Form. It gives you an address as to where you want to send all your samples to the Central Analytical Laboratory, 2204 Griffith Drive, Dock B, Champaign, Illinois, 61820. We have pre-printed labels. If you do not have pre-printed labels, then that's where Section 9 comes in, and we'll eventually get to that section as we move along. In the upper left-hand corner, you're going to see an area that says Place Barcode Sticker here. There's two barcodes for every sample. One will say Field Form with your site ID, Field Form. The other one will say Site ID, Sample Bottle. Where we want that sticker for the sample bottle be put on the bottle bag, not on the bottle itself. Section number 1 is the site ID, name and site ID. Wherever you're located, for example, the name of my site or our site here at the Illinois State Water Survey is called Bonneville. Site ID is Illinois 11. You always want to make sure that you write that down so it's very clear. We do everything in our data review and our data processing based upon putting stuff in under your particular site. Section number 2 is the observer. What can happen in that section is we always want you to print your name as legible as possible. What happens is at certain sites, the same person may do it week in and week out. So if there's issues in regards to, say, the sample or some data or something like that, then we refer to Section 2 as a contact. A lot of times there'll be different operators, different observers at different sites, so it's imperative that the person that actually does the collecting of the sample and the processing of the data put their name in that section. That way, if there is a question and we need to get in contact with you in some capacity, then we know who to ask for. One thing, getting ahead of yourself a little bit, and I've been known to do it too, as you finish up a field form, say, for yesterday, just to get a little bit ahead of yourself, then you'll write your name in for the next week. And if something were to happen where you're not able to make it and somebody fills in for you, you see what I'm talking about. There can be a little confusion because you would be the one that I would contact, and you haven't actually done the sample collecting. So the person that actually collects the sample needs to be the person that prints their names and puts their initials in section 2. Section 3, the on and off time. There's where a vast majority of the, I guess I need to clarify or interpret what needs to be put in this area. Self-explanatory, yes. What happens is the on time is always, the date, the complete date and time. The off time is the complete date and time. Now, I hope that makes sense, because your off time for your sample, just for example, yesterday was the 12th of November. So my off time was 11, 12, 13 at 1200 hours. So as I progress to the following week, my next on time should always be what my off time is for the previous week. The only time that it should not be the same is if there's site maintenance going on. So say I took my bucket off at 12 o'clock, but I noticed that there's a little vegetation around the site, and I want to, clean up the vegetation, do some things like that, some cleaning of the collector and stuff like that before I put my next bucket on. It's okay to have, a half-hour gap if that's what you're doing. Please put that on the field form down in the remarks section down below in block 10. What we're seeing an awful lot of is operators saying, okay, I took my bucket off at 12 o'clock, but I put my next bucket on at 11. And that's not possible. So there's a gap overlap there, and we need you to be very conscientious about that the time off and the next time on is always the same. Is there any questions and clarification? I'm going to stop real quick there and see if anybody has any questions. A standard sample to be valid has to be 194 hours or less. So if you go a little bit beyond, it actually adds out to 8 days and 2 hours. So if you go a little bit beyond, and you have a different date, clarify as to why your date doesn't go for a 7-day period. And you can do that in block 3 and then make your operation. Having to be aware of the equipment functions. Did the collector, sensor, heater, and motor box operate properly? If you're going out there and you visually inspect, you're the first one to see your collector, and you notice that the collector is maybe stuck halfway in between the two buckets, then your answer in that particular 4-1 would be no. Rain gauge operated properly during the week. If you're able to download your data without any problems, view your data or take it back to the lab where you process your sample, and you plug your little flash drive or your PDA into your computer, and you're able to view your data, and you're seeing that everything looks good, and we'll elaborate a little bit more on that here momentarily, then that would be a yes. Did the collector open and close at least once during the week? One thing to do when you change your sample out is you open your collector and give yourself enough time, whether it be with the AeroChem by putting enough water on the sensor, the collector will stay open and allow you to change your sample. Or with the Incon, as you change your sample, you open it up and you shut the power off long enough for you to be able to get the bucket in and out without causing any sort of contamination. What you want to do is at that juncture, once you're done with getting your bucket out and your new bucket on, is to make sure that the collector will open and close on its own without any assistance. You're able to tell, and I'll show you as we progress along in this, how you determine how you can see if the collector opened and closed. Now with the electronic gauges, it's not as eye-aware apparent as it is if you're using your Belfort chart, because on the top line of a Belfort chart, it'll make an indication with the pins going up as to whether you had an opening and closing of the collector. So that's where you need to be very aware. Did the collector open and close? If you do it when you first leave or get to the site to change your sample, that's one. and you do it when you get to the site to change it out, that's 2. That'll be 2 cycles that you have during the week. Any other openings that go from your Tuesday to Tuesday period within that Tuesday to Tuesday period will be considered the collector open and closed at least once during the week. Section 4.4 is the rain gauge winterize. We're getting into that time of year where operators are just kind of playing it by ear. They don't necessarily want to totally winterize with chances of rain still in the forecast, but so to speak, in the electronic gauges, it's when you actually put the antifreeze in the gauge. Remember, it's a 60-40 mix. If you do not have the instructions for winterizing your electronic gauges, then holler at me, email me or call me, and I'll get you those instructions. If you're still dealing with an old Belfort type of a rain gauge, winterization means when you took the funnel off and you added the antifreeze. What I'm seeing from some operators in filling this out is one week it'll be winterized and the next not winterized. So make sure that you actually make the determination as to what's winterized and what's not. We do have sites that are winterized year-round. We have sites that are never winterized. Moving on to block number 5. This is something that you actually have to look at twice. In our previous webinars, I've always stressed that when you get to the site and you look into the bucket, that you make a determination and write down what you see in the bucket, because during transportation from the field site to your laboratory, the movement of the water, the little splashing as you try to minimize, may dilute the contaminants that are currently in the bucket at the point when you first looked into the bucket. So if that's actually something I ask you to do twice, but it's very apparent as to how we make our determination for sample contamination. Block number 6. And before I move to block number 6, are there any questions?
Yeah, if they have a 3 to 4 minute gap when they're making sure the sensor operates properly, do you want them to record that gap when they fill one?
No, I mean, it's just if you're going to take the question is, if there's a 3 or 4 minute gap between taking a bucket off and putting your next bucket on so they can determine whether the sensor in motor box is functioning properly, go ahead and use that 2 or 3 minutes. You took it off at 12 o'clock. You didn't put your next one on until 12:05. That's fine. You've got a little time gap there to be able to do your site maintenance, your cleaning your collector, your lid seal, any bird manure that may be on the sensor. So yes, it's okay to record and it does not necessarily have to be right onto the minute, but within 15 minutes.
Also, just mentioned that we're going to have new sample change-out SOPs that go through the field form step by step.
Yes.
It'll be online very soon.
What Brian and I are going to do is update the sample observer report form, the protocol for doing that, updating it with the newer field forms and making a few changes, and that will be available online. So after the first of the year, we'll get that situated and make that available to everybody online. Are there any more questions? As we move to block number 6, if you've got a dry sample, the weights that we ask for are the bucket, lid, and sample. If you have a dry sample and you still say, well, why do I need to weigh this particular bucket? I didn't have any rain. We ask that you do that on a weekly basis, and you'll find the weights to the buckets on 2 sides and on the bottom. On the lids, they'll be on there twice. And you put that together and you put it on your scale to weigh in comparison with what we get. A lot of times it's our way of troubleshooting if you could potentially be having scale issues. So that's why we ask you that even though you didn't have any precipitation, to always weigh your sample, to put down the cow bucket weight, the cow lid weight, and the total sample volume, even though there isn't precipitation. If you've had so much rain that the bucket is full, and I know that sometimes taking it off of a collector, spilling a little bit, trying to make a determination as to how much was spilt. If you spill something, never pour it back into the bucket. It's just going to be a lost total sample weight. Any questions on block number 6? Moving to block number 7. That's the precipitation record. Probably the thing I ought to stress more than anything, and you say, well, I'm from, southern Florida. We haven't had snow in the 50 years that I've lived in southern Florida, and I write in a precipitation amount, but I forget to write the type. We will not make assumptions on any capacity. Why we don't make assumptions is the fact that we want to hold the operators responsible for always being in a routine and making sure. It would be easy for us to take a sample from southern Florida and they write in the precip amounts, and then, they don't write the types, and we can circle it. But then again, the change has been made on our field form, but it hasn't been made on your particular field form. So that's what we ask you to always make sure that you write the amounts down in this section along with the types, and at the end to always add those up. For the Belfort records, if you're still using a Belfort chart or a rain gauge, you write your amounts in. If you're using a NOAA 4 gauge or an Pluvio gauge, once you do your download, whether it be on your PDA or on your flash drive, and you take it back to your computer and you're able to view your data, then you can go ahead and fill in those amounts as to how much precipitation it is and what type of precipitation it is. And then you put your sample depth and your rain gauge depth and let us know if it's within the 5% by doing the math. For sites that are in the Colorado, the Wyomings, the Montanas, the Idahos, where you get a lot of snow, going to the optical sensor on the Incon has improved the collection efficiency. Those that have ever operated a aerochem with the grid sensor in the cold, dry winter climates know that you may get 4 or 5 inches of precipitation in your rain gauge, but not get anything in your collection bucket, and that's because of the fact is that the grid sensor does not, take and melt that particular type of precipitation, especially when the wind is taken into consideration. With the optical sensor, as the snow flies through that optical sensor, what you'll see is that collector open, but if the wind is up, whatever falls into that particular bucket may just as easily blow out. So that's why sometimes you'll see the big discrepancies. A question that's asked by a lot of operators is, okay, on my total rain gauge depth, I wrote down 2 inches, but when I look at my data later on the web page, it says that I only had 1.90 inches. How come the difference? After your data is sent to us, then it is reviewed by our site liaison, Roger Claybrook. He looks through the data and removes any noisy data or false precipitation that may have occurred from wind shake or anything that may have occurred that is not actually precipitation. That's not necessarily a red light to say that, oh, you did something wrong. It's just our way of interpreting what we see, and the data that you see on the web page will be the final data after it is processed and reviewed. Any questions up to that point? Section 8. This is a good one. Sometimes you'll get a sample completely dry and an operator will write, did you pour the sample? And you get the yes. If you didn't pour, you didn't pour. If you did, then please mark accordingly. Anything that you can, when you open that collector lid on Tuesday, if you've got 2 drops in your bucket, decant it and send it. If it's bone dry, then that's one that we won't worry about. If you are able to pour any sort of measurable precipitation, what you think might be precipitation, go ahead and decant it into that bottle. What you may see in your bottle a lot of times is residual water from the washing process here at the cap. Try to shake out any excess precipitation out of that before decanting your sample into the bottle. And then once you have decanted your sample into the bottle, make sure the lid is good and secure and tight for the ride. Any questions up to that point? Section number 9 is supplies. The only way that we normally will send supplies are in those big 6-in-1 boxes where we send you all your sampling supplies. If you've been ordering something for 3 or 4 weeks, please have the patience to know that when you send in your next big box, that you should receive your supplies when you get your box back. If for some reason you've been ordering something and you get a big box back and your supplies are not in there, don't hesitate to give me a call and I will pack it up as quickly as we can and get it out to you. We apologize, but we also do a lot of sites. We have a lot of sites within the network, so there are some oversights. Section number 10 is the remarks section. If anything occurs out of the ordinary, if there's something that you want to be able to tell us that you weren't able to describe to us in 1 through 9 in those sections, don't hesitate to write it. We don't want a novel or a total dissertation, but just tell us. If you've gone up to the site and you've seen that you've had some animal activity and possible, the activity may have possibly in some way contaminated the sample or had something to do with the integrity of the sample, those are the kind of remarks that we want to see. Did your collector function properly? You mark that down in section 4, but also mark it in more detail down in section 10 of the field form. As you look at the field form itself, one thing that we've added as far as being able to keep the operators aware of what we're seeing is the next slide Brian will bring up. This is called our sample receipt report form. Basically, this is broken down into the same sort of scenario as our field form. If you're filling out your field form and you have not filled out a particular section or something, you will get a sample receipt report form. Even if you've done everything perfectly, you're still going to receive a sample receipt report form. You should submit 52 samples a year and you should get 52 sample receipt report forms. The way this works is when you get one of these after the data is processed, the sample is checked in, given its ID number, then you will be sent one of these along with, let's go to the next page, 2 pages if we could. You will get an email that looks like this as well, and it will say, "Dear whoever the operator is." Attached is a sample receipt report form. This does not mean that you've done anything wrong. If there's some bit of data that has been left out, it will appear on your sample receipt report form, and it will also be written in this particular Dear ledger, and then it'll be highlighted in yellow marker as to specifically what data correction that we are looking for. So you have 2 ways of looking at it when you get the sample receipt report form. When we first started, we were getting a lot of operators that were worried, thinking they were doing something wrong. This is just a good way for us to process the data and look for, missing data or missing types or whatever it may be, and letting the operators know that we're very conscientious of what is occurring and the importance of the data that is missing that we need to receive. Okay, you've filled out your data, you've downloaded your eGauge and everything like that. How do I look at what I've done specifically? And we're going to move on to the very end where it allows you to look at your precipitation data. We want to go back real quick and just let you look at it. Move back, Brian. I overstepped my bounds just a little bit. Go back to the Illinois 11.
And another quick question.
Okay.
How long should they keep the sample receipt report on hand?
The question is, how long should you keep the sample receipt report form on hand? You can keep them all. I mean, if you're getting an email, you don't necessarily have to keep them at all, but we'd ask that if you're going to process these things 2 or 3 years down the road, a lot of times we're finding supervisors or funding agents that want to see what may have occurred at the site during a certain period of time, and it's really good to be able to refer back to those. I mean, it's 52 weeks worth of paper. You get the emails, and it's kind of good to refer back to if you do have problems that you incur. I want to move back to,
one more question.
okay, one more question.
On section 7 of the precipitation, when they mark trace, they receive the report back with a negative 0.77.
Okay.
I want to know what's going on.
The question is, when they fill out their report form in section 7, the Precip records, when they mark a trace, they receive back a minus 0.77. Minus 0.77 was a trace figure that we used to use for the Belfort rain gauge. It is not part of the criteria for the NOAA 4 or the Pluvio electronic rain gauge, so that's why you don't see those anymore. Any more questions? I just want you to refer to the picture up on the screen right now. This is a particular sample from our Illinois 11 Bonneville site. Basically, it's the, everything that is filled in. This guy is a very conscientious operator. Just certain things that you'll see when the sample's been sent in. It's given a ID number in the upper right-hand corner. We just passed our 380,000th sample, and they're all given number IDs, and that's what you'll see. That number is TM0807SW. In the upper right-hand corner of that particular field form, too, you'll say there's an area that says bag, leak, and SP. We ask that the bottle always be bagged, and that's why we mark yes. In the shipping process, was there any leakage? In that particular sample, no. And then what you'll see in the lower right-hand corner is in red pen, the circle. It's not within the 5%. It's an E gauge. Don't be alarmed by red ink. That's just how we go about writing things down. It's an internal type of thing. As you flip the page, okay, go ahead. Question?
For example, on that one, section 5.3, they marked yes for contam. They want to know, should you always describe the contamination in the remark section?
It's not necessary. The question is, should you always describe what the contamination is in the sample condition in block 5? It's not necessary. I mean, if you mark yes, it gives you options, soot, ash, and dirt particles. So, yeah, if you're able to distinguish as to what the real contamination is, yeah, we'd like to have you circle that. You see the field form, and now move to the next one, and this will actually be the sample receipt report form for that particular sample, and you can see everything that's marked down on this particular for this particular sample itself. It gives you a sample ID, the initials, start on and off time, all the way down to block number 10. The operator had no remarks, just a computer-generated remark that says collector undercatch greater than 15%. If there's a discrepancy, sometimes we'll look at it. Can be equipment-related, can also be weather-related, wind-related. So we take into consideration, but that's a good flag for us to be able to determine whether the collector is functioning properly or not. Any questions? Let's move on to the last couple slides. This is the Precip data page. You can refer to it in the upper line, the nadp.sws.uiuc.edu. You can read all that. What you want to do is bring down your particular site ID. In this case, we are still using the sample that I showed you a moment ago from Illinois 11. Okay, we have Illinois 11. We're highlighting the dates that we want to use, which is October 29th through November 5th. We have it marked down below where you can see how do you want to look at this. Do you want to look at this on a daily, an hourly, or a raw, and for which collector? Now, for this particular site, we have an NTN collector, a mercury collector, and a Airmon collector, and I can describe what those are. But what we want to do is we want to view data, and we want to view everything related to this particular sample in our data review. So everything is marked under the plot section. We want to look at it from a daily under the data tables. And for this particular sample, we're going to look at all three of our collectors. If you're just running one collector, all you need to do is mark the NTN collector and it'll come up. Next page, please. After you've clicked on that to view data. This is basically what it's going to look like. If you've never familiarized yourself with this, after you send your data to us, this comes up within a matter of moments. After it's sent to us, then it's scrutinized and reviewed quickly and then put on the website for its availability. Basically, in breaking this down, the only thing that we'll really be interested in the breakdown of this is collector 1 is the NTN, collector 2 is the MDN, collector 3 is for the Airmon. So everything right of where it says collector 1 is nothing that we're really interested in. You have to the far left where it says dates. It gives you a daily breakdown. If you're filling out section number 7 of your field form, this is where you want to put the amounts that you put in those in that particular section. So on the 29th we had 500s, 900s on the 30th and on down the line, giving us our total precipitation. That's what we saw, 2.03 in our total precipitation versus our sample weight precipitation of 1.69. Accountability as far as depth, the increase. If you don't want to empty your rain gauge every time, that's why you see a variation in the depths. That's why it grows higher and higher. You say, well, I only had 1.85, but at my counted depth in inches at 3.46. That's because the precipitation that was in there previously has not been removed. What minimum voltage means, that's all part of the way that the collector is operating. Don't get concerned with the temperatures or the collector voltage. What I do want to make you aware of real quick are the collector cycles. For a aerochem, a cycle is considered one that goes all the way over to the dry side and all the way back. That's considered a cycle. For the Incon collector, that's one that goes all the way off of anything that is gone through that optical sensor that will lift that lid over to the plate, and then when it has an opportunity to come back. The difference between an aerochem and an Incon is the records for exposure time on an Incon is broken into 15-minute records, where the aerochem is just an open and close. You may have a 1 or 2 minute open and close. With the particulars for the Incon in association with the NOAA 4 gauge and the Ott Pluvio is broken down in 15-minute records. So let's review this real quick. On the 29th, I had 6 cycles. 7/800ths of an hour is my wet exposure. My dry exposure is minimal. My mist exposure is nothing. At the end of the week, what we want to look at is when you're filling out section number 4.3, it says, did my collector open and close at least once during the week? You can look at that and say, well, I had 33 cycles, so yeah, it opened and closed more than once. The wet exposure is something that you want to take into consideration in section 4.1. Did my collector sensor work properly and motor box work properly? If you've got a lot of wet exposure and you've got, minimal dry exposure, this is a perfect sample here. What you want to be conscientious about when you look at this on a weekly basis is the amount of dry exposure and mist exposure. If you're in the type of environment or atmosphere where you're getting some dry snow, where you're getting some freezing and different types of precipitation like that, especially with the Incon collectors, you may see where the wet exposure and the dry exposure are about the same, or maybe even sometimes the dry exposure being a little bit more than the wet exposure. That's nothing to be alarmed about. It's just the way that the particular cycle or the particular collector cycles itself. Mist exposure, once again, that's nothing to be alarmed about. We review these numbers. What we want you to be conscientious of is your collector cycles and your wet exposure. The dry exposure we look at and the mist exposure, if the collector is not functioning properly, and this is the 2 areas or the 2 times that you open and close the collector at the beginning of the week and at the end of the week when you go to change them out, these are 2 areas where you can always make the determination, not by just looking at my data, but determining it from a field aspect. Did the collector open and close properly? And so kind of like a check for yourself. Are there any questions? I know that we've covered a lot of information. we once again at NADP and under the Central Analytical Laboratory do not make assumptions. We send a lot of data through. We process a lot of data. Stuff left off the field form, we're going to chase. Sending your data on a weekly basis. If you have e-gauges, whether it be a PDA, whether it be a flash drive, or whether you be set up on telemetry. When you send in a sample, the data or the e-gauge data ought to accompany it. If you're sending us a sample and then 4 weeks later sending us the data, then that's data that we have to backpedal, go back in and enter in, and then basically review instead of doing it on a more timely fashion. So we ask that you, as you're taking the sample off, processing the sample, filling out your field form, downloading your data, that you all put this as a big package and ship it off to the Central Analytical Laboratory, and the address is on top of the field form. Are there any questions? There are no questions so far. I hope the interpretation of the field form made sense to everybody. I hope that if there are any questions, that you don't hesitate to either email the number or email the website above, ntn@isws.illinois.edu, or call me at the 1-800 number, 1-800-952-7353. If you call, leave a message. I normally have my phone with me. If I miss your call initially, I'll try to call you right back. Any questions? Okay. Like I said, if this is the first time that you've had an opportunity to join us for our online NADP training webinars, we welcome you and hope that you'll come back again and find the information very useful. You can go to go.illinois.edu/NADP training and refer to the other webinars that we have currently had to refer to those. Just because it's something that we may have done long ago, if you review it and watch it and you have a question about it, call me. We'll talk about it. I'm here to help. I'm user-friendly and appreciate all the correspondences and the feedback I get on these webinars and in general. If that's it, we do not plan on having a webinar in December, so on behalf of everybody associated with the NADP, Program Director David Gay, Central Analytical Laboratory Lab Manager and Director Chris Lehman, and my engineer Brian Kirshner, this is Jeffrey Pribble saying thank you for joining us and look forward to a happy holiday season.